Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. I was 19 when our family decided to adopt a dog from the local animal shelter. It was the spring of 2019, and I had just finished my first year of community college, feeling restless and uncertain about my future. The dog we brought home was a golden retriever mix named Penny, though her coat was more cream-colored than truly golden. She had these expressive brown eyes that seemed to understand everything you said to her, and an energy level that could exhaust a marathon runner. Our house sat on the outskirts of Millfield, a town so small it barely qualified for a dot on most maps. With a population hovering around 800 people, everyone knew everyone else's business, and privacy was a luxury few could afford. The nearest city was over an hour's drive away, which meant entertainment options were limited to what nature could provide. Fortunately, our property backed up to thousands of acres of state forest land, creating an endless playground for a restless college student and an energetic dog. Those first few weeks with Penny were a revelation. She had this insatiable need to explore, to sniff every tree trunk, investigate every rustling bush, and chase every squirrel that dared cross her path. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself looking forward to our daily walks more than I had anticipated. What started as simple 30-minute strolls around our neighborhood quickly evolved into hour-long expeditions into the surrounding woodlands. The forest behind our house was a mixture of hardwood and pine, with well-worn deer trails crisscrossing through the undergrowth. During those early explorations, I stuck to the obvious paths, the ones that showed clear signs of regular use by both animals and the occasional human visitor. Penny would trot ahead of me, her tail wagging constantly, occasionally doubling back to make sure I was keeping up with her pace. My parents were supportive of these hiking adventures, especially my mother, who worried that I spent too much time indoors playing video games and browsing social media. Fresh air and exercise, she would say, that's what you both need. She wasn't wrong. Those walks became a daily ritual that I genuinely craved, a break from the suffocating routine of small-town life and the pressure of figuring out what to do with my future. As weeks turned into months, I began to notice changes in both Penny and myself. She became more confident in the woods, her initial cautious exploration giving way to bold investigation of every interesting scent or sound. I, meanwhile, found myself becoming more attuned to the forest's rhythms, learning to identify different bird calls, recognizing the signs of various animals that called these woods home, and developing an almost instinctive sense of direction among the trees. The regular trails we followed were pleasant enough, winding through stands of oak and maple, crossing small creeks via fallen logs or makeshift bridges, and occasionally opening up into small clearings where wildflowers bloomed in season. But after months of following the same routes, I began to feel a familiar restlessness creeping in. The trails that had once seemed like gateways to adventure now felt routine, predictable, even boring. Penny seemed to sense my growing dissatisfaction with our usual routes. She would pause at familiar trail junctions, looking back at me with what I swear was disappointment when I chose the same path we had walked dozens of times before. It was as if she was asking, "Aren't we going to try something new today?" Her silent reproach finally convinced me that it was time to venture beyond our comfortable boundaries. The decision to leave the established trails wasn't made lightly. I had grown up hearing stories about people who got lost in these woods, sometimes for days, before search and rescue teams could locate them. The forest was vast, with thousands of acres stretching in every direction, and it was easy to become disoriented among trees that all looked remarkably similar. But I was confident in my growing familiarity with the area, and I always carried a compass and my cell phone, though service was spotty at best in the deeper parts of the forest. Our first off-trail adventure was modest, a short detour from one of our regular paths to investigate what looked like an old logging road. The road had been reclaimed by nature years ago, but the route was still visible as a slight depression in the forest floor, marked by trees that were noticeably younger than their surroundings. Penny loved this new territory, her excitement obvious as she bounded ahead, nose to the ground, following scent trails that were invisible to me. That first successful deviation from our routine opened up a world of possibilities. Over the following weeks, we began exploring old logging roads, abandoned trails, and game paths that led deeper into the forest than I had ever ventured. We discovered hidden clearings where deer had bedded down, leaving circular impressions in the tall grass. We found streams that weren't marked on any map I had seen, crystal clear water flowing over smooth stones and creating tiny waterfalls that sparkled in the filtered sunlight. Each new discovery fueled my growing obsession with exploration. I started researching the history of our local forest, learning about the logging operations that had once dominated the area, the old homesteads that had been abandoned when the timber played out, and the network of roads and trails that had connected these remote settlements to the outside world. Much of this infrastructure still existed, hidden beneath decades of new growth, but still navigable for those willing to push through the undergrowth. Penny thrived on these adventures, her confidence growing with each successful expedition. She developed an uncanny ability to navigate through the forest, often leading me along paths that I wouldn't have noticed on my own. Sometimes I wondered if she could sense things that were beyond my perception, the way she would suddenly change direction or pause to examine something that looked perfectly ordinary to me. As summer progressed, our hiking adventures became longer and more ambitious. We would set out early in the morning, when the air was still cool and the forest was alive with birdsong, and wouldn't return home until late afternoon, both of us tired but satisfied with our discoveries. I began carrying a small backpack with water, snacks, and a basic first aid kit, treating these expeditions with the seriousness they deserved. The forest was revealing its secrets to us, one hidden trail at a time. We found abandoned deer stands, their wooden platforms weathered and overgrown with vines. We discovered old stone foundations, probably the remains of cabins or outbuildings from the area's logging days. In one memorable expedition, we stumbled across what appeared to be an old cemetery, its handful of weathered headstones barely visible among the encroaching vegetation. But it was during one of our longer explorations on a humid day in late August that we made the discovery that would change everything. The morning of August 28, 2019, started like many others that summer. I woke before dawn, eager to beat the heat that had been building steadily over the past week. The weather forecast called for temperatures in the low 90s, with humidity levels that would make the air feel thick and oppressive by midday. If we were going to have a successful hiking adventure, we needed to get an early start. Penny was already awake when I padded into the kitchen, her internal clock apparently synchronized with my hiking schedule. She watched me prepare our usual supplies, 2 bottles of water, a handful of granola bars, some jerky for protein, and a small bag of treats for her. I had learned from experience that these longer expeditions required more preparation than our early neighborhood walks. By 6:30, we were heading out the back door and into the forest. The air was still relatively cool, carrying the scent of pine needles and morning dew. Birds were active in the canopy above us, their calls echoing through the trees as they went about their early morning routines. Penny trotted ahead of me with her usual enthusiasm, occasionally pausing to investigate an interesting scent before hurrying to catch up. Our destination that morning was a section of the forest we had spotted from a ridge during our previous expedition, but hadn't yet explored. It lay beyond a series of low hills in what appeared to be a natural depression that held a different type of vegetation than the surrounding areas. From our distant vantage point, it had looked like a mixture of hardwood and evergreen trees, with what might have been water reflecting light somewhere in the center. The hike to reach this unexplored area took us through familiar territory for the first hour, following one of our established off-trail routes through a series of old logging cuts. The forest floor here was relatively open, with most of the undergrowth cleared years ago when the trees were harvested. Young pines had grown up in the spaces between the older hardwoods, creating a mixed canopy that filtered the morning light into a soft, green-tinted glow. As we crested the first of the low hills, the character of the forest began to change. The trees grew closer together, their trunks thicker and older than what we had been walking through. The undergrowth became denser, forcing us to push through tangles of berry bushes and young saplings. Penny had to work harder to find clear paths, sometimes disappearing into the vegetation before emerging several yards ahead of me. The second hill was steeper and more challenging, its slope covered with loose rocks and fallen logs that made footing treacherous. I found myself grabbing onto tree trunks for support, my hiking boots slipping on the damp leaves that carpeted the forest floor. Penny, with her four-legged advantage, managed the climb much more easily, though I noticed she was panting more heavily than usual despite the relatively cool morning air. From the top of the second hill, we could see our destination more clearly. The depression in the forest floor was larger than it had appeared from a distance, probably covering several acres. The vegetation was indeed different here, with more evergreen trees and what looked like areas of wetland scattered throughout. Most intriguingly, there were several open spaces that might have been clearings or possibly bodies of water, though the distance and the angle made it difficult to tell for certain. The descent into this hidden valley was steep and required careful navigation. The soil was different here, darker and more organic, as if water regularly collected in this area during heavy rains. The trees were older too, some of them massive specimens that must have escaped the logging operations that had claimed most of their brethren. Their canopy was so thick that very little sunlight reached the forest floor, creating a twilight atmosphere even though it was still mid-morning. Penny's behavior began to change as we descended into the valley. Her usual eager exploration became more cautious, more deliberate. She would pause frequently, raising her nose to test the air, her ears rotating to catch sounds that were beyond my hearing. Several times she looked back at me with what I interpreted as uncertainty, as if she was asking whether we should continue. The air in the valley felt different. It was cooler, which was welcome given the rising temperature, but it also felt heavier, more humid. There was a smell too, not unpleasant exactly, but earthy and organic in a way that reminded me of compost or rotting vegetation. The sounds were different as well. The bird calls that had been constant throughout our hike grew sporadic, and there was an underlying silence that felt unnatural in a forest that should have been teeming with life. As we pushed deeper into the valley, we encountered our first area of wetland. It wasn't quite a swamp, but the ground was soft and spongy underfoot, with standing water visible in the low spots. Cattails and other wetland plants grew in thick clusters, and I could hear the sound of water moving somewhere ahead of us, though I couldn't see its source. Penny picked her way carefully through this area, her paws making soft squelching sounds in the muddy ground. The evergreen trees became more dominant as we continued, their needle-covered branches creating an almost tunnel-like effect over what appeared to be an old trail. The path was barely visible, more of a game trail than anything humans had created, but it seemed to lead in the direction we wanted to go. The pine needles underfoot muffled our steps, making our passage almost silent except for the occasional crack of a dead branch or the rustle of vegetation as we pushed through denser areas. After nearly an hour of careful navigation through this changing landscape, we finally reached what appeared to be the center of the valley. The trees opened up slightly, revealing a roughly circular clearing perhaps 50 yards across. The ground here was covered with a thick carpet of pine needles and decomposing leaves, creating a soft surface that felt almost spongy underfoot. But what immediately caught my attention wasn't the clearing itself, but what lay at its far edge. There, nestled between the massive trunks of several ancient pine trees, was a body of water unlike anything I had seen in our months of forest exploration. It wasn't the kind of clear, babbling creek or small pond that we had encountered elsewhere. This was something altogether different, something that made me stop in my tracks and stare. The water was perfectly dark, so dark that it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The surface was absolutely still, without even the slightest ripple to disturb its mirror-like appearance. It was roughly oval in shape, perhaps 60 or 70 feet at its widest point, and extended back into the shadows between the trees far enough that I couldn't see its far shore. But what really captured my attention, what made me stand there staring despite Penny's obvious discomfort, was the single dead tree that stood in the center of the dark water. It wasn't a fallen log or a piece of debris that had somehow ended up there. This was a tree that had apparently grown in that spot, died, and remained standing even as the water level around it rose. Its pale, leafless branches reached up toward the canopy like gnarled fingers, creating a stark silhouette against the dark water. There was something almost hypnotic about the scene. The contrast between the perfectly still, dark water and the skeletal tree created an image that seemed more like something from a dream than a real place hidden in the forest. I found myself drawn toward the water's edge, my feet moving almost without conscious direction. It was then that I noticed Penny's reaction, and it was unlike anything I had seen from her during all our months of hiking together. Penny had stopped moving entirely, her body rigid with a tension I had never seen before. She stood about 10 feet behind me, her legs slightly spread as if bracing herself against some invisible force. Her ears were pinned back against her head, and her tail, usually wagging or at least relaxed, was tucked tightly between her legs. But most disturbing of all was the sound she was making. A low, continuous whine that seemed to come from deep in her throat, a sound of pure distress. I turned away from the dark pond to look at her more closely. "What's wrong, girl?" I asked, using the gentle tone that usually calmed her when she was anxious. But instead of responding to my voice, she took several steps backward, never taking her eyes off the water behind me. Her whining grew more intense, and I could see that her whole body was trembling. In all the months we had been hiking together, through encounters with wild animals, thunderstorms, and challenging terrain, I had never seen Penny react this way to anything. She was typically a brave, confident dog who approached new experiences with curiosity rather than fear. Even when we had stumbled across that old cemetery with its weathered headstones, she had investigated it with interest rather than anxiety. But this was different. Every instinct she possessed seemed to be telling her that we needed to leave this place immediately. I looked back at the pond, trying to see it through her senses, to understand what had triggered such an extreme reaction. The dark water remained perfectly still, its surface like black glass reflecting the canopy above. The dead tree in its center stood exactly as it had when we first arrived, its bare branches reaching toward the sky. Nothing had changed, nothing had moved, and yet Penny's distress was escalating by the minute. "It's okay," I said, taking a step toward her. "It's just water, probably a natural spring or something." But even as I spoke the words, I felt uncertain about them. There was something about this place that didn't feel entirely natural, though I couldn't articulate what it was. Penny backed away further as I approached, her whining now mixed with short, sharp barks that echoed strangely in the clearing. The sound seemed to be absorbed by the surrounding trees and the dark water, creating an odd, muffled effect that made the barks sound distorted and unnatural. She was trying to tell me something, trying to communicate an urgency that went beyond her usual canine concerns. I knelt down and extended my hand toward her, using body language that usually reassured her when she was nervous. "Come here, Penny. It's all right." But she wouldn't come closer. Instead, she took several more steps backward, putting increasing distance between herself and both me and the pond. Her behavior was so unprecedented that I began to wonder if there might be a more practical explanation. Perhaps she could smell something I couldn't detect, some chemical contamination in the water that her more sensitive nose had picked up. Or maybe there was a dead animal somewhere nearby, decomposing in a way that created scents alarming to a dog but undetectable to humans. I stood up and walked slowly around the perimeter of the clearing, staying well back from the water's edge, but trying to get a better sense of the area. The pine needles and decomposing leaves underfoot were thick enough to muffle most sounds, but I could hear my own footsteps clearly enough. There were no obvious signs of dead animals, no overwhelming scents beyond the earthy, organic smell I had noticed when we first entered the valley. The trees surrounding the pond were ancient specimens, their trunks thick enough that it would take 3 or 4 people holding hands to encircle them. Their bark was deeply furrowed and covered with patches of moss and lichen. Some of them showed scars from old lightning strikes or storms, but they appeared healthy despite their age. There was nothing obviously threatening about the forest around us. But Penny's reaction continued to escalate. Her whining had become almost continuous now, punctuated by sharp barks that sounded increasingly desperate. She had backed up almost to the edge of the clearing, positioning herself near what appeared to be the clearest route back the way we had come. Her message was clear. She wanted to leave, and she wanted to leave now. I had learned to trust Penny's instincts during our months of hiking together. She had warned me about unstable footing on steep slopes, alerted me to the presence of wild animals before I had seen or heard them myself, and guided us away from areas that might have been dangerous for reasons I didn't understand. Her senses were far more acute than mine, and her survival instincts were undoubtedly better developed. But despite her obvious distress, I found myself reluctant to leave. There was something about this place that fascinated me, something that drew me back toward the dark water despite the rational part of my brain that said I should listen to my dog's warnings. The pond was unlike anything I had seen before, and the opportunity to explore it might not come again. I compromised by moving closer to the water's edge while keeping one eye on Penny's reaction. The ground near the pond was soft and muddy, my boots sinking slightly with each step. The mud had an odd consistency, almost clay-like, and it made a soft sucking sound as I lifted my feet. The closer I got to the water, the more unstable the ground became, until I was standing on what felt like a thin crust over much softer material beneath. From this closer vantage point, I could see that the water was not completely opaque. There were depths visible beneath the dark surface, though they quickly faded to black just a few feet down. The dead tree in the center was more impressive up close, its trunk easily 3 feet in diameter, and its branches spreading in complex patterns that created intricate shadows on the water's surface. But what struck me most was the absolute stillness of the water. Even with a slight breeze moving through the canopy above, the surface remained perfectly smooth. There were no insects skimming across it, no fish jumping, no signs of the life that should have been present in any natural body of water. It was as if the pond was somehow separate from the ecosystem around it, untouched by the normal cycles of forest life. Penny's barking became more frantic, and when I looked back at her, I saw that she had moved even further away from me. She was now at the very edge of the clearing, partially hidden behind one of the large pine trees. Her distress was so obvious that I felt guilty for not responding to her warnings immediately. "All right, girl," I called to her. "We'll go in a minute. Just let me take a quick look around." But as I spoke those words, something happened that changed everything. The perfectly still surface of the dark water was disturbed by a single small ripple that spread outward from somewhere near the base of the dead tree. It was subtle, barely visible, but in water that had been absolutely motionless, it was as obvious as a scream. I froze, staring at the spot where the ripple had originated. There was no wind strong enough to create such a disturbance, no falling leaves or debris that could have broken the surface tension. The ripple had come from beneath the water, something moving in the depths that I couldn't see. As I watched, transfixed, another ripple appeared, this one slightly larger and originating from a different location. Then another, and another, until the surface of the pond was marked by a series of concentric circles that overlapped and interfered with each other in complex patterns. Penny's barking reached a pitch that was almost painful to hear, a sound of pure terror that cut through the forest air like a siren. She was no longer just warning me. She was pleading with me to move, to get away from whatever was creating those ripples in the dark water. but I couldn't move. I stood there, ankle deep in the muddy ground at the pond's edge, watching the disturbances in the water multiply and grow stronger. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. Fish, though I had seen no signs of aquatic life, bubbles from decomposing organic matter on the bottom. Even small underground springs that might create currents in the water. But none of those explanations felt adequate as I watched the pattern of ripples become more complex, more organized, as if something large was moving purposefully beneath the surface. The dead tree in the center began to sway slightly, its branches creaking in a way that suggested the water around its base was being disturbed by something substantial. It was then, as I stood there mesmerized by the increasingly active water, that I noticed something that made my heart race. One of the larger ripples was moving in my direction, crossing the pond in a straight line that would bring it to the exact spot where I was standing. The ripple approaching me moved with a deliberate purpose that defied any natural explanation I could conjure. It wasn't the random disturbance of fish or the gentle spread of bubbles rising from decomposing matter. This was something large, something directed, something that seemed to have noticed my presence at the water's edge and was coming to investigate. I wanted to step back, every rational instinct screaming at me to retreat to safer ground, but my feet seemed rooted in the muddy soil. The approaching disturbance created a wake in the dark water, a V-shaped pattern that grew wider as it drew closer. Whatever was causing it had to be substantial, far larger than any fish that should have inhabited a forest pond. Penny's desperate barking had become a continuous sound of alarm, but it seemed to come from very far away despite her proximity. My attention was completely focused on the water, on the approaching ripple that was now only 20 feet from shore. The wake it created disturbed the reflection of the dead tree, breaking the skeletal branches into fragmented pieces that danced across the surface. 15 feet. 10 feet. The disturbance was slowing now, as if whatever created it was approaching more cautiously. The water just offshore from where I stood began to darken further, if such a thing was possible. What had been black as night seemed to deepen to an even more profound darkness, as if something large was rising from the depths. I found my voice and took a stumbling step backward, my boot making a loud sucking sound as I pulled it free from the mud. The noise seemed to echo across the water, and in response, the approaching disturbance stopped entirely. The pond returned to its mirror-like stillness so abruptly that I wondered if I had imagined the entire episode. But I hadn't imagined it. The evidence was still visible in the pattern of waves that lapped gently against the muddy shore. The only sound in a forest that had become unnaturally quiet. Even Penny had stopped barking, though when I glanced back at her, I could see that she remained rigid with terror, her eyes fixed on the water behind me. I took another step backward, then another, my eyes never leaving the surface of the pond. The stillness that had returned seemed different now, charged with potential energy, as if the water was holding its breath. The dead tree in the center swayed slightly in a breeze that I couldn't feel, its branches creating soft creaking sounds that carried clearly across the water. It was as I was taking my fourth or fifth step backward that it happened. The thing I had been both dreading and anticipating, the moment that would haunt my dreams for months to come. Something broke the surface of the water. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. There was no splash, no violent eruption from the depths. Instead, something pale simply appeared above the waterline, so smoothly and quietly that it took several seconds for my brain to process what I was seeing. At first, it looked like a piece of driftwood or maybe a dead fish floating belly up. But as I stared, frozen in place, the shape became more defined, more recognizable, more terrifying. It was roughly oval, about the size of a dinner plate, and it was positioned near the base of the dead tree where the approaching ripple had originated. The color was wrong for anything that should have been in forest water. Instead of the browns and greens of natural organic matter, this was a pale, sickly white, like something that had been submerged for far too long. The surface appeared smooth, but seemed to shimmer slightly, as if covered by a thin film of some kind. As I watched, paralyzed by a mixture of fascination and growing horror, the pale shape began to rotate slowly in the water. What had appeared to be a simple oval revealed itself to have more complex contours, ridges, and depressions that caught the filtered light in unsettling ways. There were darker spots visible on the surface, arranged in a pattern that my mind struggled to interpret. It was Penny's renewed barking that finally broke the spell. Her voice cut through my trance like a physical blow, reminding me that I was standing in an increasingly dangerous situation. The pale thing in the water had stopped rotating and was now oriented directly toward me, as if it had somehow detected my presence and was studying me in return. I stumbled backward more quickly now, my rational mind finally overriding the horrible fascination that had kept me frozen at the water's edge. The ground became more stable as I moved away from the pond, my footing more secure on the thick carpet of pine needles that covered the clearing. But even as I retreated, I couldn't stop looking back at the water. The pale shape remained visible just below the surface, maintaining its orientation toward my position. As the distance between us increased, I could see that it was larger than I had initially thought, extending several feet in each direction. The darker spots on its surface were arranged in a pattern that looked almost like... I forced myself to stop that line of thinking. Whatever I was seeing, whatever had risen from the depths of that dark pond, I didn't want to examine it too closely. Some knowledge was too dangerous, some sights too disturbing to contemplate fully. Penny was already moving toward the edge of the clearing when I reached her position. She pressed against my legs for a moment, as if reassuring herself that I was still there, then immediately began leading the way back toward the trail we had followed into the valley. Her message was clear. We were leaving, and we were leaving now. I followed her gratefully, casting one final look back at the pond as we reached the tree line. The pale shape was still visible in the water, still oriented in our direction. But now there were others. 3 or 4 similar forms had appeared near the dead tree, all of them maintaining the same unsettling focus on our retreat. The hike back through the valley seemed to take forever. Every sound made me jump. Every movement in the peripheral vision made me spin around to check behind us. Penny led us unerringly back along the route we had taken, her usually enthusiastic exploration replaced by a focused determination to put distance between us and the dark pond. The climb out of the valley was harder than the descent had been, made more difficult by my frequent looks over my shoulder and the adrenaline that was making my hands shake. By the time we reached the ridge that overlooked the depression, both of us were breathing heavily, though from exertion or fear, I couldn't say. From our elevated position, I could see back down into the valley, though the thick canopy made it impossible to locate the pond among the trees. The entire area looked peaceful and ordinary from this distance, showing no signs of the disturbing discovery we had made. If I hadn't experienced it myself, I would never have believed that such a place existed in our familiar forest. The remainder of our hike home was completed in relative silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. Penny stayed closer to me than usual, occasionally looking back the way we had come as if checking to make sure we weren't being followed. Her behavior remained subdued even after we emerged from the forest and could see our house in the distance. It wasn't until we were safely inside, with the door locked behind us, that I began to process what we had experienced. I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water, trying to make sense of what I had seen in that dark pond. Penny lay at my feet, still showing signs of stress, her breathing more rapid than normal and her ears constantly moving as she monitored sounds from outside. The rational explanations I had considered while standing at the water's edge seemed inadequate now. Dead fish didn't orient themselves toward observers. Decomposing organic matter didn't rise to the surface in organized patterns. And nothing natural should have been able to create the sense of focused attention I had felt coming from those pale shapes in the water. But if natural explanations were insufficient, what did that leave? The alternative possibilities were even more disturbing. touching on things that rational people didn't believe in, things that belonged in horror movies rather than the real world. I spent the rest of that day trying to convince myself that I had imagined or misinterpreted what we had seen. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was in that pond. Something that didn't belong in any forest ecosystem I had ever heard of. And worse still, whatever it was had been aware of our presence, had watched us, had perhaps even followed us to the water's edge. As night fell and I prepared for bed, I made a decision. We wouldn't be returning to that part of the forest. There were plenty of other areas to explore, other trails to follow. The dark pond and whatever inhabited it could remain undisturbed, a secret that Penny and I would keep to ourselves. But even as I made that resolution, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. The memory of those pale shapes in the dark water, their unsettling focus and apparent intelligence, had lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. I would think about them when I was trying to fall asleep, wonder about them during quiet moments, and feel drawn back to that hidden valley despite every rational instinct telling me to stay away. The dark pond had become an obsession, and obsessions, I was about to learn, have a way of drawing us back whether we want to go or not. That first night after our encounter at the pond, I barely managed to get any rest at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those pale shapes floating just beneath the dark surface, their unknown forms oriented toward me with what felt like malevolent attention. When I finally did drift off, my dreams were filled with images of murky water and reaching branches, of things moving in the depths that I couldn't quite see clearly. I woke repeatedly throughout the night, sometimes from dreams so vivid they felt real, other times simply because my mind refused to quiet itself. During those wakeful hours, I found myself analyzing every detail of what we had experienced, trying to construct rational explanations for what we had seen. But each attempt at logical reasoning eventually collapsed under the weight of what I knew to be true. Penny seemed to be having similar difficulties. She paced restlessly through the house, occasionally whining softly as she stared out windows that faced the direction of the forest. When she finally settled down, it was on the floor next to my bed, rather than in her usual spot in the living room. Even in sleep, she remained alert, her ears twitching at sounds that I couldn't detect. The next morning brought no relief from the obsessive thoughts that had plagued me through the night. Over breakfast, I found myself sketching the layout of the clearing, trying to capture the relative positions of the trees, the shape of the pond, and the location where those pale forms had appeared. The act of drawing helped me organize my memories, but it also made the experience feel more real, more undeniable. My parents noticed my distracted state but attributed it to the usual concerns of a college student facing an uncertain future. When my mother asked about our hike the previous day, I gave a vague response about exploring new areas of the forest. I wasn't ready to share what we had discovered, partly because I wasn't sure they would believe me, and partly because talking about it would make it feel even more real. Over the following days, I tried to maintain our normal hiking routine, but both Penny and I seemed reluctant to venture far from familiar trails. We stuck to the well-known paths, the areas we had explored many times before, avoiding any routes that might lead us back toward that hidden valley. But even on these familiar walks, I found myself constantly scanning the forest, looking for signs of anything unusual or out of place. The obsession grew stronger rather than weaker as time passed. During quiet moments at home, I would find myself researching local history, looking for any mention of unusual bodies of water in our area. I searched online forums dedicated to local hiking and outdoor activities, hoping to find someone else who had discovered the same pond and could provide some explanation for what we had experienced. But my searches turned up nothing. There were no reports of dark ponds in our section of the forest, no mentions of unusual wildlife or strange phenomena. Either no one else had found the place we had discovered, or if they had, they weren't talking about it publicly. The latter possibility was almost as disturbing as the former. A week passed, then two, and still the memory of that dark water haunted my thoughts. I began to avoid hiking altogether, making excuses when Penny showed signs of wanting to go out for our usual adventures. She seemed to understand my reluctance and didn't push the issue, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes. Our daily expeditions had been as important to her as they were to me, and my withdrawal from them was affecting her mood and energy level. It was during the third week after our encounter that I made a decision that I knew was probably unwise but felt inevitable. I had to go back. The not knowing was worse than whatever we might face by returning to the pond. The constant speculation, the endless questions without answers, the way the memory had taken up residence in my mind like an unwelcome guest, it all had to end. I planned the return trip carefully, bringing more supplies than usual, extra water, emergency food, a fully charged cell phone, though I doubted there would be service in that remote valley, and even a waterproof flashlight in case we ended up staying later than planned. I also brought a camera, an old digital model that my father had given me years earlier. If I was going to investigate this mystery properly, I needed documentation. Penny seemed to sense my intention before I announced it. As I gathered my hiking gear, she retreated to a corner of the living room and watched me with what I could only describe as resigned dread. She knew where we were going, and she clearly didn't want to make the journey. But she also understood that I was determined to go with or without her, and her loyalty wouldn't allow her to let me face whatever waited in that valley alone. The hike back to the hidden pond took longer than our first trip, partly because I was being more careful about marking our route, and partly because both Penny and I were moving more cautiously. As we descended into the valley, I could feel the same oppressive atmosphere that had been present during our first visit. The air was heavy and still, the sounds of forest life muted and subdued. When we finally reached the clearing, everything appeared exactly as we had left it. The dark water was mirror still, the dead tree stood sentinel in its center, and the thick carpet of pine needles showed no signs of disturbance since our last visit. But something felt different, charged with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. Penny refused to enter the clearing, positioning herself at its edge where she had a clear escape route. I couldn't blame her for her caution, but I had come too far to turn back now. I approached the water's edge more slowly this time, my camera ready and my senses alert for any sign of movement beneath the surface. For several minutes, nothing happened. The pond remained still and dark, showing no trace of the disturbances we had witnessed during our first visit. I began to wonder if the entire experience had been some kind of hallucination, a shared moment of panic that had caused us both to imagine things that weren't really there. But then, just as I was beginning to doubt my own memories, something moved in the water near the dead tree. It was subtle at first, just a slight darkening in an area that was already nearly black. But as I watched through the camera's viewfinder, the disturbance grew more pronounced. The pale shape that emerged this time was different from what I remembered. It was larger, more clearly defined, and it broke the surface with a confidence that suggested it was no longer hiding from observation. As I watched, transfixed, it was joined by others, until there were at least half a dozen pale forms visible in the dark water. They were arranged in a rough circle around the base of the dead tree, and they were all oriented toward me. There was no question now about their awareness of my presence. Whatever these things were, they were watching me with the same intensity that I was watching them. I raised my camera and began taking pictures, the digital clicks sounding unnaturally loud in the silent clearing. Through the viewfinder, I could see details that weren't visible to my naked eye. The pale shapes had textures and contours that were disturbingly organic, surfaces that seemed to ripple and shift even as I watched. But it was when I lowered the camera to check the images I had captured that I received the shock that would send me running from that place once again. The camera's LCD screen showed the clearing, the dark water, and the dead tree in perfect detail. But the pale shapes that I could clearly see floating in the pond were completely absent from the photographs. According to my camera, the water was empty. I stared at the camera's display screen in disbelief, scrolling through the images I had just taken. Each photograph showed the same thing: a dark, still pond with a dead tree in its center, surrounded by ancient pines in a shadowy clearing. The composition was perfect, the lighting adequate, the focus sharp. But the pale shapes that were clearly visible to my eyes were nowhere to be found in the digital images. I looked up from the camera to confirm what I was seeing. The forms were still there, floating in their rough circle around the base of the dead tree, their surfaces catching what little light filtered through the canopy. They seemed more solid now, more present, as if my return to this place had somehow strengthened their ability to manifest. But when I looked back at the camera, they remained absent from every image. I tried adjusting the camera settings, switching from automatic to manual mode, changing the flash settings, even altering the white balance in case some unusual lighting condition was affecting the sensor. Nothing worked. No matter how I configured the camera, no matter what angle I shot from, the photographs showed only empty water where I could clearly see those pale, watching forms. The implications were deeply disturbing. Either there was something wrong with my perception, some kind of hallucination or optical illusion that was causing me to see things that weren't really there, or there was something present in the water that existed outside the normal spectrum of light that cameras could detect. Neither possibility was comforting. I decided to try a different approach. Instead of photographing the water directly, I began documenting everything else about the location. I took wide shots of the entire clearing, close-ups of the unusual vegetation, detailed images of the dead trees' branches and bark patterns. If I couldn't capture evidence of what was in the water, at least I could prove that this place existed. But even these seemingly straightforward photographs revealed anomalies. The dead tree, which appeared to be standing vertically in the center of the pond, showed up in the images as tilted at an impossible angle, as if it was leaning far to one side despite clearly standing upright to my eyes. The water level in the photographs appeared to be several feet lower than what I could observe directly, exposing muddy banks that weren't visible in reality. Most disturbing of all, when I photographed the clearing from different angles, the relative positions of the trees seemed to shift in ways that defied perspective. A large pine that appeared to be on my left in one image would show up on my right in the next, despite the fact that I had moved only a few steps between shots. Penny's distress was escalating again, her whining becoming more urgent as I continued my photographic documentation. She had backed away from the clearing entirely and was now positioned well into the tree line, ready to bolt at the first sign of real danger. Her behavior suggested that whatever was happening here was getting worse, not better. I tried taking pictures of Penny herself, hoping that at least those images would appear normal. But even photographs of my own dog came out strangely distorted. Her proportions seemed wrong, her features subtly altered in ways that made her look like a different animal altogether. In one particularly unsettling image, her eyes appeared to be reflecting light even though there was no flash, giving them an unnatural, almost luminous quality. The pale shapes in the water had begun to move more actively, creating gentle ripples that spread outward in complex patterns. But these disturbances, like the forms that created them, were invisible to the camera. The water appeared perfectly still in every photograph, even when I could clearly see its surface being disturbed by the movement of the watching entities. I forced myself to move closer to the water's edge, despite every instinct screaming at me to retreat. If the camera couldn't capture what was in the pond, perhaps I could observe details that would help me understand what I was dealing with. The muddy ground at the water's edge was treacherous, and I had to be careful not to lose my footing as I approached. From this closer vantage point, I could see that the pale shapes weren't floating on the surface as I had initially thought. They were suspended just beneath it, perhaps 6 inches or a foot down, but clearly visible through the dark water. They had a translucent quality that allowed me to see suggestions of internal structure, dark spots and lines that might have been organs or vessels of some kind. As I watched, one of the forms began to rise higher in the water, approaching the surface with deliberate slowness. The water above it began to bulge upward, creating a dome-like distortion that grew more pronounced as the thing beneath drew closer to breaking through. I raised my camera instinctively, knowing it wouldn't capture anything but needing to try anyway. The surface tension finally broke, and a portion of the pale form emerged into the air above the water. What I saw in that moment defied every rational explanation I had tried to construct over the past 3 weeks. The thing that rose from the dark pond was organic but wrong, familiar in its general shape, but disturbing in its details. It looked like a face. Not a human face exactly, but something that shared enough characteristics with human features to be recognizable while remaining utterly alien. There were depressions where eyes might have been, a vertical ridge that could have been a nose, and a horizontal line that suggested a mouth. But the proportions were wrong, the symmetry imperfect, and the entire surface had a texture that looked like it had been underwater for far too long. The face-like form turned slowly in my direction, and I felt a moment of connection, of recognition, that chilled me to the bone. Whatever this thing was, it was aware of me, not just as a presence in its environment, but as an individual entity. It was studying me with the same focused attention that I was directing toward it. Other forms began to surface around the first, each one slightly different but sharing the same basic characteristics. They emerged with varying degrees of completeness, some showing only suggestions of features, others revealing more detailed structures that I didn't want to examine too closely. All of them oriented themselves toward my position at the water's edge. I took photograph after photograph, knowing they would show nothing but compelled to try. The camera's mechanical sound seemed to echo strangely in the clearing, bouncing off the water and the surrounding trees in ways that created an almost musical rhythm. But the LCD screen continued to show only empty water, providing no validation for what my eyes were recording. It was when I lowered the camera to check the latest batch of images that I noticed something that made my heart race. While the pale forms remained invisible in the photographs, there was something else present in the water that hadn't been there before. Dark shapes moved beneath the surface, shadows that seemed to dart and weave among areas where I could see the pale entities floating. These shadow forms were visible in the camera, appearing as dark streaks and undefined masses that moved through the water with obvious purpose. They seemed to be circling the pale entities, sometimes passing directly beneath them, sometimes approaching close enough to create turbulence in the water above. The presence of these shadow forms in the photographs while the pale entities remained invisible suggested that I was dealing with multiple phenomena, things that existed on different levels of reality or perception. The pale faces could be seen by my eyes but not recorded by the camera, while the dark shadows were invisible to direct observation, but showed up clearly in the digital images. The implications were staggering. I was witnessing the intersection of multiple realities, multiple forms of existence that normally remained separate but were somehow overlapping in this hidden location. The dark pond wasn't just a body of water. It was some kind of boundary point, a place where different dimensions or states of being could interact. Penny's barking cut through my theoretical contemplation like a physical blow. She was no longer just distressed. She was terrified, backing away from the clearing with her hackles raised and her tail tucked between her legs. Her barks had taken on a quality I had never heard before, a sound of pure alarm that suggested immediate danger. I looked back toward the water and saw that the situation had changed dramatically. The pale faces were no longer content to float passively at the surface. They were moving, rising higher out of the water, revealing more of their impossible anatomy with each passing moment. And they were no longer arranged in a circle around the dead tree. They were moving toward the shore, toward me. The rational part of my mind insisted that I document this unprecedented event, that I continue taking photographs, even though they weren't capturing the most important elements of what was happening. But my survival instincts were stronger than my scientific curiosity. I took one final shot, then turned and ran toward where Penny was waiting at the edge of the tree line. As I ran, I could hear sounds behind me that I didn't want to identify. Wet, sliding noises that suggested movement through muddy ground, and splashing sounds that indicated something large was disturbing the water. I didn't look back, didn't slow down, didn't stop until we were well clear of the valley and climbing toward the familiar ridgeline that would lead us home. But even as we fled, I knew that this encounter had changed something fundamental about my relationship with that place. The entities in the dark pond were no longer content to remain hidden, no longer satisfied with passive observation. They had revealed themselves more completely, had shown me glimpses of their true nature that would be impossible to forget. And most disturbing of all, they had begun to move toward me, suggesting that the boundary between their world and mine was becoming increasingly permeable. Whatever was happening at that remote pond, it was escalating, and I was somehow at the center of it. The weeks following our second encounter at the pond were consumed by obsessive research. I spent hours online, searching through local historical records, geological surveys, and any documentation I could find about our region's natural features. The photographs I had taken, while they didn't show the pale entities, did provide clear evidence of the pond's location and unusual characteristics. I used these images to cross-reference topographical maps and satellite imagery, trying to find any official record of the water body we had discovered. What I found was deeply unsettling. According to every map I could locate, there was no pond in that area of the forest. The topographical surveys showed the valley as a slight depression with seasonal wetlands, but nothing that suggested a permanent body of water large enough to match what we had found. Even recent satellite images from online mapping services showed only dense forest canopy in the location where I knew the pond existed. This discrepancy between observed reality and official documentation suggested that the pond was either a very recent formation or it existed in some way that made it undetectable to standard surveying methods. Neither possibility was particularly comforting, especially given the strange behavior of my camera during our visits. I expanded my research to include local folklore and historical accounts, searching for any mentions of unusual phenomena in our area. This proved more fruitful, though the information I found raised more questions than it answered. In the County Historical Society's digitized archives, I discovered several references to a place called Devil's Mirror, described in 19th century accounts as a dark body of water hidden deep in the forest. According to these old records, Devil's Mirror was discovered by early loggers who avoided the area after several workers reported seeing faces of the drowned in its waters. One account from 1887 described how a logging crew's foreman had vanished near the pond, leaving behind only his boots and hat on the muddy shore. Search parties found no trace of him, and the logging company abandoned their operations in that section of forest rather than risk losing more men. The historical accounts contained details that matched our discoveries with unsettling accuracy. References to a dead tree standing in the center of the water, descriptions of the pond's perfect stillness, and mentions of the oppressive atmosphere that surrounded the area all aligned with what Penny and I had experienced. But most disturbing were the repeated references to the pond's inhabitants, pale forms that watched from beneath the surface and seemed to draw the living toward the water's edge. I found newspaper clippings from the early 1900s that mentioned several disappearances in the area, always described as hunting or hiking accidents, but with details that suggested something more sinister. In each case, personal belongings were found near bodies of water, but the victims themselves were never recovered. The pattern continued sporadically through the decades, with reports becoming less frequent as the area became more remote and less visited. But the most significant discovery came when I located the personal journal of a forest ranger named William Hayes, who had worked in our area from 1965 to 1989. Hayes had kept detailed records of his patrols and observations, and his journal contained multiple references to what he called the watching pond. His descriptions matched our experiences so precisely that I felt as if he had been writing about our specific encounters. Hayes wrote about finding the pond during a routine patrol in 1967 and being immediately struck by its unnatural characteristics. Like us, he had experienced equipment malfunctions when trying to document the location. His compass spun wildly near the water, his radio produced only static, and photographs came out strangely distorted or completely blank. He described seeing pale forms in the water that seemed to track his movements and showed signs of intelligence that no natural phenomenon should possess. Most importantly, Hayes had developed a theory about what the pond actually was. Based on his observations over 22 years of monitoring the area, he believed that the water body existed at some kind of dimensional junction point, a place where the normal laws of physics broke down and other realities could intrude into our own. He theorized that the pale entities were inhabitants of this other reality, trapped at the boundary between worlds, but capable of limited interaction with our dimension. Hayes's journal entries became increasingly disturbed over the years, suggesting that his repeated exposure to the pond's influence was affecting his mental state. His final entries, dated just weeks before his retirement, described dreams where the pale faces called to him from the dark water, promising answers to questions he had never thought to ask. He wrote about feeling drawn to return to the pond despite knowing it was dangerous, and about sensing that the entities were becoming more active, more aware of the world beyond their watery prison. The journal ended abruptly with an entry that simply read, "They're getting stronger. The boundary is weakening. God help whoever finds this place next." Hayes had disappeared during a fishing trip in 1990, less than a year after his retirement. His body was never found, though his truck was discovered parked at a trailhead that led directly toward the area where Penny and I had found the pond. Armed with this historical context, I began to understand that our encounters were part of a pattern stretching back over a century. The pond, Devil's Mirror, as the old records called it, was a recurring source of unexplained phenomena and mysterious disappearances. Whatever existed in its dark waters had been claiming victims for generations, drawing them close with curiosity before pulling them into depths that no rescue team had ever been able to search. But the most disturbing revelation from my research was the suggestion that the entities in the pond were becoming more active over time. Hayes's observations indicated that their ability to manifest and interact with our reality was growing stronger, and his final journal entries suggested that this process was accelerating. If his theories were correct, then my repeated visits to the pond might have contributed to this escalation, providing the entities with additional energy or awareness that allowed them to extend their influence. The implications were terrifying. If the boundary between dimensions was indeed weakening, if the pale entities were gaining strength and becoming more capable of affecting our world, then the danger extended far beyond just those foolish enough to visit the pond directly. Eventually, their influence might spread beyond the confines of the dark water, reaching into the surrounding forest and potentially threatening anyone who entered the area. I realized that I faced a terrible choice. I could stay away from the pond, hoping that my absence would allow the situation to stabilize, but knowing that I would never have answers to the questions that haunted me. Or I could return one more time, armed with the knowledge I had gained from my research, and attempt to understand what was really happening in that hidden valley. The decision was made for me when I found Penny standing at our back door early one morning, staring out toward the forest with an intensity that I had never seen before. When she noticed me watching her, she looked back at me with eyes that seemed almost human in their expression of urgent communication. She was trying to tell me something, trying to convey a message that went beyond normal canine behavior. It was then that I realized the entities in the pond weren't content to wait for us to return to them. Somehow they had established a connection with both of us during our previous visits, a link that was drawing us back whether we wanted to go or not. The obsessive thoughts, the constant awareness of the pond's location, the way it dominated my dreams and waking hours. These weren't just normal human curiosity. They were signs of an influence that extended far beyond the physical boundaries of that dark water. Penny and I were being called, summoned by entities that existed at the intersection of realities. And based on the historical pattern I had uncovered, answering that call had never ended well for anyone who had tried it before us. But ignoring it might be even more dangerous. If the entities were indeed growing stronger, If they were reaching out beyond their watery prison to touch the minds of those who had encountered them, then running away might only delay the inevitable. Eventually, the compulsion would become too strong to resist, and I would find myself walking toward that dark pond whether I chose to or not. The only way to break the cycle was to confront it directly, to return to Devil's Mirror one final time and attempt to understand the true nature of what dwelt in its depths. It was a dangerous choice, one that had apparently claimed the lives of others who had made the same decision. But the alternative, living under the growing influence of entities that existed outside normal reality, was even worse. I began planning our final expedition to the pond, knowing that this time we might not be coming back. I spent 3 days preparing for what I knew would be our last visit to the pond. This time I approached the expedition with the seriousness of someone who might not return, making arrangements that would be necessary if Penny and I simply disappeared into the forest like so many others before us. I left detailed notes about our discoveries hidden in my room, along with copies of all the research I had conducted and the historical documents I had uncovered. If something happened to us, at least there would be a record of what we had found. The equipment I gathered was more extensive than anything I had brought on previous hikes. Along with the usual supplies of food and water, I packed a waterproof flashlight, extra batteries, a length of rope, and even a small folding shovel that I thought might prove useful if I needed to examine the muddy shore of the pond more closely. Most importantly, I brought 2 cameras, the digital model that had failed to capture the pale entities, and an old film camera that my grandfather had given me years earlier. If there was something about digital technology that prevented proper documentation of what existed in the pond, perhaps analog film would prove more effective. Penny seemed to understand the significance of this final expedition. Her behavior over the past few days had become increasingly strange, alternating between periods of intense alertness and episodes of what could only be described as trance-like fascination. She would stand for hours staring toward the forest, her body rigid and her eyes unfocused, as if she was listening to sounds that I couldn't hear or seeing sights that were invisible to me. When I showed her the hiking gear I had assembled, her reaction was unlike anything I had seen from her before. Instead of the usual excitement that accompanied preparations for our forest adventures, she displayed a resigned acceptance that was almost human in its emotional complexity. She seemed to understand that we were being drawn back to that place against our better judgment, compelled by forces that neither of us fully comprehended. We set out before dawn on a gray October morning, the air crisp with the promise of an early winter. The forest was entering its dormant phase, with most of the leaves fallen and the remaining vegetation taking on the brittle, colorless appearance of approaching death. Our breath formed visible clouds in the cold air, and frost crunched under our boots as we made our way along the familiar trails that would lead us back to the hidden valley. The hike to the pond seemed different this time, charged with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand up, despite the layers of clothing I wore. The forest was unusually quiet, with none of the bird calls or small animal sounds that normally provided a soundtrack to our expeditions. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath in anticipation of what was to come. As we descended into the valley, the oppressive atmosphere that I remembered from our previous visits intensified dramatically. The air became thicker, harder to breathe, and carried scents that reminded me of stagnant water and decomposing organic matter. Penny's behavior became increasingly agitated, her movements jerky and unpredictable as she struggled against some invisible compulsion that was drawing her forward. When we finally reached the edge of the clearing, I stopped in shock at what I saw. The pond had changed since our last visit, expanded beyond its previous boundaries to cover nearly the entire floor of the small valley. What had once been dry land was now submerged beneath dark water that reflected the gray sky above like a massive mirror. The dead tree that had stood in the center of the original pond was now just one of several skeletal trunks that protruded from the expanded water surface, their bare branches creating a forest of reaching fingers that broke the water's perfect stillness. But most disturbing of all were the pale forms that were now visible throughout the enlarged pond. Where before I had seen only a handful of entities floating near the original dead tree, now there were dozens of them, arranged in complex patterns that suggested some kind of organization or purpose. They were no longer hiding beneath the surface, but floating openly on top of the water, their pale, face-like forms clearly visible from my position at the clearing's edge. Penny whined softly and pressed against my legs, but she didn't retreat as she had during our previous visits. Instead, she seemed transfixed by the sight before us, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and fascination that mirrored my own emotional state. We were both caught between the rational desire to flee and an irrational compulsion to approach the water and discover what the pale entities wanted from us. I raised both cameras and began documenting what we found, taking photographs with both the digital and film models in the hope that one or the other would capture evidence of what we were witnessing. Through the viewfinders, I could see that the expanded pond covered an area that should have been impossible given the valley's topography. The water extended up the slopes of the surrounding hills, defying gravity and geography in ways that suggested this place operated according to rules that had nothing to do with normal physics. The pale entities began to move as I photographed them, turning their attention toward our position with obvious awareness of our presence. They didn't seem hostile exactly, but there was something in their orientation that suggested purpose, as if our arrival had triggered some predetermined response. Several of them began to drift toward the shore where we stood, moving through the water with smooth, purposeful strokes that left barely visible wakes behind them. As they drew closer, I could see details that had been invisible from a distance. The pale forms were indeed face-like, but they possessed characteristics that no human face should have. Their eyes were dark voids that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and their mouths were horizontal slits that occasionally opened to reveal depths that extended far beyond what should have been possible. Most disturbing of all, their features seemed to shift and change as I watched, as if they were not quite solid, not quite permanent in their physical form. One of the entities reached the shore and began to emerge from the water, revealing more of its impossible anatomy with each passing moment. What rose from the dark pond was roughly humanoid, but wrong in every detail. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at angles that defied skeletal structure, and skin that had the translucent quality of something that had never been exposed to sunlight. Penny began to bark, her voice high and desperate as she tried to warn me away from the approaching entity, but her bark sounded strange in the oppressive atmosphere of the valley, muffled and distorted as if the air itself was absorbing the sound. I found myself unable to retreat, transfixed by the sight of something that clearly didn't belong in any reality I understood. The entity stopped at the water's edge and extended what might have been an arm toward me. Its limbs stretched much farther than should have been anatomically possible, reaching across the 10 feet of muddy ground that separated us. At the end of the impossibly long appendage was something that resembled a hand, but possessed too many fingers, each one ending in what looked like a small, dark eye. I understood then that this was what had been calling to me, drawing me back to this place through dreams and obsessive thoughts. The entity wanted something from me, needed something that I possessed. But what it was offering in return was a knowledge that no human mind was equipped to process, an understanding of realities that existed beyond the boundaries of normal experience. As the impossible hand reached toward me, I made a choice that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Instead of taking the offered appendage, instead of allowing myself to be drawn into whatever existence these entities inhabited, I grabbed Penny's collar and ran. We fled from that valley as if our lives depended on it, and perhaps they did. Behind us, I could hear sounds that I had no names for, wet, sliding noises that suggested movement through impossible spaces, and what might have been voices calling in languages that predated human speech. But I didn't look back, didn't slow down, didn't stop running until we were miles away from that cursed place. When we finally reached home, both of us exhausted and traumatized by what we had experienced, I immediately began making plans to leave the area. I couldn't live knowing that such a place existed so close to our home. Couldn't sleep peacefully knowing that entities from other realities were expanding their influence into our world. Within a week, I had convinced my parents that I needed to transfer to a college in another state. And by the end of the month, we had moved away from that small town and its hidden horrors. But even now, 5 years later, and hundreds of miles away from that dark pond, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night with the certainty that something is calling to me from across the distance. In my dreams, I see pale faces floating in dark water, their impossible eyes fixed on me with patient, eternal attention. They are waiting, I know, for me to return and accept what they offered that day in the hidden valley. The photographs I took during our final visit developed exactly as I had expected. The digital images showed only empty water and dead trees, while the film photographs revealed the expanded pond in all its impossible glory, but captured no trace of the pale entities that I knew inhabited its depths. It was as if they existed in a spectrum of reality that no technology could record, visible only to minds that had been touched by their influence. I kept both sets of photographs as evidence of what we had discovered, but I've never shown them to anyone else. Who would believe such a story? Who would accept that there are places in our world where other realities intrude, where entities that exist outside normal experience can reach across dimensional boundaries to touch the minds of the living? Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had taken that offered hand, if I had allowed myself to be drawn into the dark water with its patient, waiting inhabitants. Would I have gained the knowledge they seemed eager to share? Or would I have simply become another unexplained disappearance, another name added to the long list of those who had vanished near Devil's Mirror? I'll never know. And perhaps that's for the best. Some knowledge is too dangerous to possess, some realities too alien to comprehend. The pale entities in that dark pond represent something that exists beyond human understanding, something that our minds are not equipped to process without losing our sanity in the attempt. But they are still there, I know, waiting in their expanded realm at the intersection of realities. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I can feel them calling to me across the miles, patient and eternal in their alien purpose. They know that eventually, curiosity will overcome caution, and someone else will find their way to that hidden valley. When that happens, I can only pray that the next visitor will be wiser than I was, strong enough to resist the terrible fascination of those pale, watching faces. Because once you've seen what dwells in the depths of Devil's Mirror, once you've felt the touch of their impossible attention, you can never quite escape the knowledge that there are things in this world that should never be disturbed. The dark pond remains, and its inhabitants continue their patient vigil, waiting for the next curious soul to stumble upon their watery realm. And when that day comes, as I know it inevitably will, another chapter will be added to the long, dark history of that cursed place where realities intersect and nightmares take physical form. I can only hope that whoever finds them next will have the wisdom to run, as Penny and I finally did, before it's too late to escape the mesmerizing pull of those pale, eternal watchers in the depths of the dark pond. I woke up earlier than necessary on that fateful Saturday in late September, my mind already racing with anticipation for our planned hike. The weather forecast promised clear skies, perfect conditions for exploring the renowned Cascade Falls Trail that had been on our bucket list for months. My wife Rebecca stirred beside me, blinking away sleep as sunlight filtered through our bedroom curtains. "You're already dressed?" she noted with a drowsy smile. "Someone's eager." I nodded, checking my watch. Thought we'd get an early start, beat the crowds. Our 3-year-old German Shepherd Bella seemed to sense the day's adventure, pacing anxiously by the front door while we packed our gear: trail mix, water bottles, first aid kit, and the usual essentials. Rebecca insisted on bringing extra layers despite the warm forecast. The temperature drops fast in those valleys, she reminded me, stuffing a fleece into her backpack. Better safe than sorry. The drive took nearly 2 hours, winding through increasingly remote countryside. The radio signal gradually weakened until static replaced the morning news program. We fell into comfortable silence, occasionally pointing out interesting landmarks or unusual cloud formations. Bella remained vigilant in the back seat, her nose occasionally fogging the window glass as she tracked scents from the passing landscape. "Did you read that article about the search and rescue operation last month?" Rebecca asked suddenly, scrolling through her phone before the signal disappeared completely. "No, what happened?" "Some hiker went off trail about 15 miles from where we're headed. Spent 2 nights out there before they found him. Apparently he was severely dehydrated and kept rambling about strange noises." I shrugged. "Probably got disoriented. People underestimate wilderness all the time." "I suppose," she said, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty that lingered between us. The parking area was beginning to fill when we arrived, but we secured a spot near the trailhead. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, invigorating after the long drive. I stretched my legs while Rebecca organized our backpacks. Bella strained against her leash, eager to begin the journey, her tail wagging with unbridled enthusiasm. "Remember," I said, examining the trail map posted on a weathered wooden board, "we stick to the main path. No unnecessary risks today." Rebecca nodded in agreement, her earlier concerns seemingly forgotten in the beauty of the morning. Neither of us could have predicted how drastically that resolution would change, or how deeply we would come to regret the decisions made in the following hours. We joined the steady stream of hikers making their way toward Cascade Falls. The trail was wide and well-maintained near the entrance, bordered by towering Douglas firs and western red cedars that filtered the morning sunlight into dappled patterns across the path. Families with children, couples with expensive camera equipment, and solo hikers with determined expressions passed us or fell behind as we settled into a comfortable pace. "It's busier than I expected," Rebecca commented, adjusting her backpack straps. "The falls are a popular attraction," I replied. "This is why I wanted to get here early." Bella led the way, her nose working constantly as she encountered new scents. Her excitement was contagious, and I found myself smiling at her occasional backward glances, as if checking that we were still following her expert guidance. The sound of rushing water grew progressively louder, signaling our approach to the falls. Through breaks in the trees, we caught glimpses of sunlight catching the spray, creating ephemeral rainbows that appeared and vanished with the shifting breeze. The path widened into a viewing area crowded with people taking photographs and children squealing with delight. Cascade Falls lived up to its reputation. A 60-foot torrent of water tumbling over moss-covered rocks into a clear pool below. The designated viewing platforms were packed with tourists jostling for the perfect angle, their voices competing with the thunderous cascade. Rebecca took several photos while I consulted our trail map. "There's a secondary trail that loops around the top of the falls," I pointed out. "Looks like it's less traveled." Rebecca glanced at the crowded platforms. "Might be nice to find some quieter spots." A park ranger stationed nearby overheard our conversation. "The upper trail is more challenging," he cautioned, "but the views are worth it if you're experienced hikers." "We are," I assured him, perhaps too quickly. "How far does it extend?" "About 4 miles around, but there's a return path that cuts back to the main trail at the 2-mile mark if you decide not to complete the full loop." Rebecca hesitated. "Is it well marked?" "The first section is," the ranger replied. "After that, the blazes are a bit faded. Just keep the creek on your left, and you'll be fine." The decision was made with surprising ease. We filled our water bottles at the public fountain, adjusted our gear, and headed toward the narrow path that snaked upward beside the waterfall. A sign warned less experienced hikers to remain on the main trail, but we continued past it, eager to escape the noise and discover views few tourists bothered to seek. The terrain immediately became more challenging. Rocks slick with spray required careful footing, and the path narrowed until we had to proceed single file. Bella, sensing the adventure, pulled ahead with renewed enthusiasm. As we climbed higher, the crowd noise diminished, replaced by the more intimate sounds of our breathing and the water's roar. Reaching a natural ledge overlooking the falls, we paused to rest. From this vantage point, the tourists below resembled colorful insects swarming around a puddle. The forest stretched in every direction, an unbroken canopy of green that seemed to swallow the horizon. "Worth the climb already," I said, taking a long drink from my water bottle. Rebecca nodded, her face flushed from exertion. "It's beautiful. But listen, notice anything?" I paused, taking in our surroundings more attentively. "It's quieter." "Not just quieter," she clarified. "No birds, no insects buzzing." She was right. Apart from the waterfall's constant rush, the forest was unnaturally silent. I dismissed the observation with a shrug. Probably just the time of day, or maybe the water noise drowns them out. Rebecca seemed unconvinced, but said nothing more as we continued our ascent. The path leveled somewhat as we moved away from the falls, diving deeper into the forest where the canopy thickened, reducing sunlight to occasional shafts that barely reached the forest floor. With each step away from the main attraction, I felt a growing sense of isolation. Not unpleasant at first, but increasingly pronounced. We were leaving the safety of numbers behind, venturing into a section of forest that suddenly seemed vast and unknowable. Bella's excited trot slowed to a more cautious pace as she navigated fallen trees and protruding roots. "The trail's getting harder to follow," Rebecca noted, pointing to faded blue markings on scattered trees. "Should we turn back?" I consulted my watch. "We've only been on this section for 30 minutes. Let's push on a bit further." The ranger mentioned a particularly good viewpoint at the creek bend. That simple decision, to continue rather than return, would prove to be the first in a series of increasingly poor choices, leading us deeper into an experience that would haunt our dreams for months to come. The deeper we ventured into the forest, the more distinct the atmosphere became from the cheerful bustle at the waterfall's base. Shadows lengthened and merged beneath the dense canopy, creating a perpetual twilight that played tricks on peripheral vision. Fallen logs and rock formations took on anthropomorphic qualities in the dim light, resembling crouched figures until examined more closely. "How far do you think we've gone?" Rebecca asked, her voice hushed as if respecting the forest's growing silence. I checked my GPS app, but the signal had weakened to the point of uselessness. "Maybe a mile from the falls. Hard to tell with all the switchbacks." The trail had narrowed further, in some places barely distinguishable from game paths that branched off in confusing directions. Blue trail blazes appeared with decreasing frequency, some so faded they required careful scrutiny to confirm their presence. Bella remained ahead of us, but had abandoned her earlier exuberance for a more methodical pace, occasionally glancing back as if to confirm we were still following. "I don't remember seeing anyone else take this trail," Rebecca observed. "Not a single other hiker. That's what we wanted, isn't it? Some peace and quiet?" She nodded hesitantly. "Yes, but it feels different somehow. Not peaceful exactly, more like expectant." I finished for her, surprising myself with the choice of word. The terrain changed gradually, becoming less hospitable. Moss-covered stones appeared with increasing frequency, some slick with moisture despite the absence of recent rainfall. The air felt thicker, carrying an earthy scent tinged with something less definable, a mustiness that clung to the back of the throat. "Do you hear the creek?" I asked, stopping to listen. According to the ranger's directions, we should have been approaching the waterway that fed the falls. Rebecca shook her head. "Nothing. But I feel like we're being watched." Under normal circumstances, I might have laughed at such a comment or dismissed it as imagination. Instead, I found myself scanning the surrounding trees with increased vigilance. The forest had grown too quiet, the silence no longer peaceful, but oppressive. "That's just the isolation talking," I said, attempting to sound reassuring despite my own growing unease. "When you're used to the city, genuine solitude feels strange." Bella stopped abruptly, her attention fixed on a dense thicket to our right. Her posture stiffened, ears forward, the ridge of fur along her spine rising slightly. "What is it, girl?" I asked, moving closer to examine whatever had caught her attention. The underbrush revealed nothing obvious. No movement, no unusual shapes, just more of the endless forest stretching into shadow. Yet Bella remained fixated, a low whine building in her throat. "Probably just a squirrel," I suggested, tugging gently on her leash. "Come on, let's keep moving." She reluctantly followed, but her demeanor had changed. The playful exploration was gone, replaced by hypervigilance. Every few steps she would pause, her head swiveling to track something I couldn't perceive. Rebecca noticed the change as well, moving closer to me as we continued along the increasingly obscure trail. "I don't like this," she whispered. "Something feels wrong." I was about to suggest turning back when we emerged into a small clearing. The sudden absence of overhead canopy allowed sunlight to flood the space, a welcome relief from the oppressive shadows. A fallen tree provided convenient seating, and we gratefully took the opportunity to rest. "Let's have some water and a snack," I suggested, shrugging off my backpack. "Then we can decide whether to continue or head back." Rebecca nodded, retrieving our water bottles while I opened a package of trail mix. Bella refused to settle, pacing the perimeter of the clearing with her nose to the ground, occasionally freezing to stare intently into the surrounding forest. "Have you noticed there are no animal sounds?" Rebecca asked between sips of water. "No birds, no insects, nothing." Now that she mentioned it, the absence was striking. Forests typically buzz with life, the distant call of birds, the rustle of small mammals in underbrush, the constant symphony of insects. Here, there was only the sound of our own breathing and the occasional snap of a twig beneath Bella's paws. "Maybe there's a predator nearby," I suggested. "Bears or mountain lions can silence an area." The thought brought little comfort. If a dangerous predator was indeed lurking nearby, our isolated position suddenly seemed far more vulnerable than adventurous. As we prepared to continue, I noticed something peculiar about the fallen tree we'd been sitting on. Unlike other deadfall in the area, this trunk bore unusual markings, a series of deep gouges running vertically along its length. They resembled claw marks, but were spaced too widely and cut too deeply to belong to any wildlife I was familiar with. "Take a look at this," I said, running my fingers along one of the grooves. "Ever seen anything like it?" Rebecca examined the markings, her expression growing increasingly troubled. "Those aren't natural," she concluded. "They're too uniform." "Could be from forestry equipment," I suggested. "Or maybe lightning struck it." Neither explanation seemed satisfactory as we studied the precise, parallel channels carved into the wood. More disturbing was the realization that similar markings appeared on several trees bordering the clearing, always in groups of 3, always at approximately the same height from the ground. "Let's go," Rebecca said suddenly, her voice tight with barely contained anxiety. "I think we should head back now." I nodded in agreement, suddenly eager to return to the populated sections of the trail. As we gathered our belongings, Bella's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She circled us frantically, her tail tucked between her legs, emitting a series of short, distressed barks. The sunlight that had initially made the clearing seem like a sanctuary now felt exposing, as if we were on display for unseen observers. As we hurriedly departed, following what we hoped was the path back toward the falls, I couldn't shake the sensation of being followed, a persistent awareness of movement just beyond visual range, keeping pace with our accelerating steps. The return journey quickly proved more challenging than anticipated. What had seemed like a straightforward trail on our outward trek now presented confusing options at every turn. Faded blazes that had guided us earlier were now difficult to locate, forcing us to guess which fork to take at several junctions. "Are you sure this is the way we came?" Rebecca asked, after we'd been walking for 20 minutes without recognizing any landmarks. I consulted my compass, attempting to orient ourselves. "The fall should be east of us. If we keep heading in that direction, we'll eventually intersect the main trail." Bella's behavior continued to deteriorate. Rather than leading us as she had earlier, she now insisted on staying between us, occasionally bumping against our legs as if seeking reassurance. Her ears remained flattened, and she startled at sounds I couldn't detect. "What's wrong with her?" Rebecca whispered, reaching down to stroke Bella's head. "She's picking up on our anxiety," I suggested, though I wasn't entirely convinced. Bella was normally unflappable, her training as a service dog before we adopted her having instilled remarkable composure even in stressful situations. The forest darkened noticeably as clouds gathered overhead, further reducing the already limited visibility beneath the canopy. What had been dappled shadow earlier became a murky gloom that seemed to swallow detail and distance. Shapes beyond a few yards dissolved into indistinct silhouettes that shifted and reformed with each blink. A sudden crack echoed through the trees, a sound like a heavy branch breaking under significant weight. We froze, straining to locate its source. "What was that?" Rebecca's fingers dug into my arm. "Probably deadfall," I answered, keeping my voice steady despite mounting concern. "Old trees collapse all the time." Another crack followed, closer this time, accompanied by the distinct rustle of movement through underbrush. Bella growled, a deep rumble that vibrated through her entire body. I'd never heard her make such a sound before. Primal and aggressive, entirely unlike her usual temperament. "Hello?" I called out, thinking it might be another hiker. "Is someone there?" My voice sounded thin and insignificant against the vast silence that absorbed it. No response came except another series of cracks now circling around to our left. Whatever was moving through the forest was large enough to break substantial branches and was making no effort to move quietly. "We need to go," Rebecca urged, already backing away. "Now." We abandoned any pretense of following the trail, simply moving as quickly as possible in what we hoped was the direction of the main path. The forest floor became increasingly treacherous. Hidden roots, sudden depressions, and slick patches of decomposing vegetation threatened to send us sprawling with each hurried step. The sounds continued, keeping pace with our retreat, but remaining just out of sight. Occasionally, branches would sway without wind, or undergrowth would part slightly, as if pushed aside by an unseen presence. Bella remained rigid, her growl giving way to whimpers of unmistakable terror. "It's hurting us," Rebecca gasped between labored breaths. "What?" "Whatever it is, it's not chasing us directly. It's steering us in a specific direction." The observation sent ice through my veins, because I recognized its truth immediately. Our panicked flight wasn't random. We were being channeled along a particular route, moving deeper into unknown territory rather than back toward safety. I forced myself to stop, pulling Rebecca to a halt beside me. "We need to be smarter than this," I insisted, fighting to control my racing heart. "Take a breath. Let's think." The snapping and rustling ceased as soon as we stopped moving, replaced by a watchful silence that felt somehow more threatening. I retrieved the compass from my pocket with trembling fingers, determined to regain our bearings. "The sun is to our west," I reasoned, trying to glimpse the fading daylight through the canopy. "So the main trail and falls must be in that direction." I pointed at a right angle to our current path. "That means we've been heading south, not east," Rebecca realized. "We're moving parallel to the main trail, not toward it." The implication wasn't lost on either of us. Our panic had made us susceptible to manipulation, driving us precisely where we shouldn't go. With renewed determination, I changed our course, deliberately moving toward where we believed the populated trail lay. Almost immediately, the forest responded. A massive crash sounded directly in our chosen path, as if a tree had been toppled specifically to block our way. Bella barked frantically, pulling against her leash in the opposite direction. "Did you see that?" Rebecca's voice rose in pitch. "See what?" I turned to follow her gaze, but found only more shadowed forest. "I thought," she swallowed hard. "I thought I saw someone standing between those trees. Just for a second." "Another hiker?" I asked hopefully. She shook her head slowly. "Not like any hiker I've ever seen." Before I could press for details, a new sound emerged from the gathering darkness, a low, rhythmic thudding like heavy footfalls on packed earth, approaching from behind us. Bella's resolve broke entirely. She lunged forward with such force that the leash slipped from my grasp and she bolted into the underbrush ahead. "Bella!" I shouted, lunging ineffectually after her. "Look!" Rebecca pointed to where our dog had disappeared. Through the vegetation, barely visible in the fading light, was a narrow opening in the hillside. A natural crevice between two boulders that widened at the bottom to form what appeared to be a passage. "She went in there," Rebecca said, already moving forward. "We need to find her." The footfalls behind us grew louder, accompanied now by a faint sound that raised the hair on my neck. A wet clicking noise like mandibles or teeth repeatedly opening and closing. With little choice remaining, I followed Rebecca toward the rocky opening, hoping it would provide temporary shelter while we composed ourselves. The space between the boulders was tight but passable, requiring us to turn sideways and shuffle carefully to avoid scraping against the rough stone. Beyond the entrance, the passage widened into what I initially took to be a shallow cave, but quickly realized was something far more disturbing. A tunnel excavated into the hillside, its walls too smooth and ceiling too regularly arched to be natural. "This isn't right," I whispered, instinctively reaching for Rebecca's hand. "This shouldn't be here." Ahead of us, Bella's whimpering echoed from the darkness, drawing us reluctantly forward into the unknown depths of what was clearly not a natural formation, but something deliberately constructed in the heart of the wilderness. The tunnel extended approximately 30 feet into the hillside before opening into a chamber roughly the size of a small classroom. My flashlight revealed walls composed of tightly packed soil, reinforced with a lattice of roots and what appeared to be animal bones. The floor was unnervingly level, packed hard by what must have been years of use. "What is this place?" Rebecca's voice wavered as she swept her own light across the disturbing scene. The beam illuminated the far wall where crude symbols had been carved into the packed earth. Angular designs and spiraling patterns that bore no resemblance to any language or pictograms I recognized. They seemed to pulse slightly in the moving light, creating an illusion of subtle movement that made my vision swim if I focused too long. Bella huddled in a corner, her entire body shaking. When I approached, she pressed herself harder against the wall, rather than coming to my side as she normally would. Her eyes, reflecting the flashlight beam, showed an animal terror that transcended ordinary fear. "Something's been living here," Rebecca whispered, pointing to a depression in the center of the chamber. The indentation resembled a nest of sorts, lined with materials that turned my stomach. Fragments of clothing in various states of decay, clumps of what appeared to be human hair, and animal remains in advanced stages of decomposition. The smell, which had been masked by the earthy scent of the tunnel, now hit me fully. A putrid mixture of rot and something musky and animal. "We need to leave," I said, backing toward the entrance. "Now." A sound from the tunnel froze us in place, the scrape of something heavy moving through the narrow passage, blocking our only exit. Bella's whimpering intensified, and she attempted to dig into the earthen wall as if seeking an alternate escape route. In desperate silence, we extinguished our flashlights and pressed ourselves against the chamber wall, hoping whatever approached might miss us in the darkness. My hand found Rebecca's, our fingers interlocking in a grip so tight it bordered on painful. The scraping continued, punctuated by the wet clicking sound we'd heard in the forest. It grew louder, then stopped abruptly at the chamber entrance. In the absolute darkness, I could see nothing, but other senses compensated with terrifying clarity. I could hear labored breathing, not the panting of an animal, but something deliberate and controlled. I could smell a new odor beneath the chamber's existing stench, a sharp, acrid scent like ammonia mixed with something metallic. Rebecca's nails dug into my palm as something entered the chamber. Though I couldn't see it, I felt its presence as a pressure change in the air, a displacement that suggested considerable size. It moved with deliberate slowness, circling the central depression. The clicking sound started again, now accompanied by a low vibration that I felt through the soles of my boots. My lungs burned with the effort of silent breathing. Every instinct screamed to run, but rational thought insisted that movement meant certain death. Beside me, Rebecca trembled uncontrollably, and I feared her fear might betray our position. The presence completed its circuit of the nest and paused. Though I could see nothing in the blackness, I knew with absolute certainty that it had turned in our direction. The breathing changed, becoming deeper and more rapid. The clicking accelerated to a continuous rattling that reminded me horribly of excitement or anticipation. It took a step toward us, a heavy, shuffling movement that revealed it was bipedal. Another step followed, then another, each bringing it closer to our position against the wall. The ammonia smell intensified until it burned my nostrils and throat. In that moment of overwhelming terror, my survival instinct finally overrode paralysis. With my free hand, I reached into my pocket and retrieved the emergency flare I always carried on hikes. In a single motion, I struck the cap against the ignition strip and threw it toward the center of the room. The flare erupted in brilliant red light that flooded the chamber, temporarily blinding me after the intense darkness. As my vision adjusted, I caught only glimpses of what stood merely feet away, a hunched figure significantly taller than myself, covered in what appeared to be ragged clothing or some form of matted fur. Its face remained mercifully in shadow, but I saw enough to know it was neither human nor any recognized animal. The creature recoiled from the sudden light, emitting a shrill keening sound that pierced through my skull like a physical pain. It stumbled backward, arms raised to shield itself from the flare's harsh illumination. "Run!" I shouted, pulling Rebecca toward the tunnel entrance. The creature lunged for us but misjudged in its light-blinded state, crashing into the wall where we had stood moments before. We scrambled into the narrow passage, the sounds of pursuit close behind as we navigated the confined space. Bella had bolted ahead of us, her survival instinct overcoming her earlier paralysis. I could hear her panicked breathing as she led our desperate escape back toward the forest and what we could only hope was safety. We burst from the tunnel into deepening twilight, our lungs burning with exertion and fear. The forest around us had transformed in our absence, the already dim light now reduced to a murky haze that rendered the surrounding trees as little more than looming silhouettes. Bella raced ahead, no longer needing the leash to keep her on course as she instinctively sought the direction of safety. Behind us, the keening sound from the tunnel changed to something more guttural, a series of barking coughs that echoed through the trees and seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. Whatever pursued us was either communicating with others of its kind or possessed the ability to project its voice in a way that created the illusion of numbers. "Don't look back," I gasped to Rebecca as we stumbled through underbrush, branches whipping at our faces and exposed skin. "Just keep moving." The terrain sloped downward, which I took as a positive sign. The falls and main trail lay at a lower elevation than the isolated path we'd followed earlier. Our headlong flight precluded any attempt at navigation beyond this basic understanding. We simply followed Bella, trusting her instinct and superior senses to guide us toward human presence. A crash sounded to our right, much closer than expected. Something large was moving parallel to our course, occasionally visible as a dark shape darting between trees. Another crash echoed from our left, confirming my worst fear. We were being flanked. "They're trying to cut us off," Rebecca realized, her voice breaking with exhaustion and terror. The forest opened slightly ahead, revealing a shallow creek bed that cut through the hillside. Without hesitation, Bella plunged into the knee-deep water and began splashing downstream. I followed her reasoning immediately. Water would mask our scent and potentially slow our pursuers. "This way," I urged, pulling Rebecca into the frigid current. We waded as quickly as possible, fighting against slippery rocks and the water's resistance. The creek bent sharply around a hillside, and as we rounded the curve, I heard Rebecca gasp. Ahead, the waterway dropped away into a series of steep cascades that eventually rejoined the main falls far below. "We can't go down that," she protested, tugging against my grip. "And we can't go back," I countered, gesturing at the forest behind us where movement was now clearly visible. Dark shapes converging on our position from multiple directions. Desperate, I scanned our surroundings for alternatives. On the opposite bank, partially concealed by overhanging vegetation, was what appeared to be a game trail cutting diagonally across the hillside. "There," I pointed. "If we can reach that path, it might lead back to the main trail." We pushed through deepening water toward the far bank, the current growing stronger as we approached the point where the creek began its descent. Bella had already scrambled up the muddy embankment and stood waiting, her hackles raised as she stared back at the forest we'd fled. The clicking sounds intensified, now accompanied by splashing as our pursuers entered the water upstream. I boosted Rebecca onto the bank, then pulled myself up with muscles burning from prolonged exertion. The path was barely visible, a slight depression in the undergrowth that wound between trees and around boulder outcroppings. We moved as quickly as the difficult terrain allowed, constantly scanning ahead for signs of the main trail while fighting the impulse to look back at what followed. Bella suddenly accelerated, her behavior shifting from fear to purpose as she detected something ahead. "I think she's found the trail," I said, allowing hope to enter my voice for the first time in what felt like hours. The game path widened slightly, showing signs of more frequent use. Through gaps in the trees below, I caught glimpses of what might have been the main waterfall, though distance and failing light made certainty impossible. A familiar sound reached us, voices, human voices, carried faintly on the evening air. Rebecca nearly sobbed with relief, increasing her pace despite obvious exhaustion. We were close now, perhaps only a few hundred yards from the populated trail where rangers and other hikers would provide safety in numbers. The forest behind us erupted with activity, branches breaking, undergrowth being trampled, and the now familiar keening rising to a frenzied pitch. Our pursuers had abandoned stealth for speed, making a final desperate attempt to intercept us before we reached safety. "We're not going to make it," Rebecca gasped, stumbling on a protruding root. I caught her before she fell, practically dragging her forward as Bella circled back to us, barking urgently. "We have to," I insisted. "Just a little further." The path bent around a massive cedar, and suddenly we were there. The main trail stretched before us, wide and well-maintained compared to the wilderness we'd traversed. In the distance, perhaps a quarter-mile downhill, flashlights bobbed as late hikers made their way back toward the parking area. "Help!" I shouted, my voice cracking with strain. "Can anyone hear us? We need help!" The distant figures paused, lights swinging in our direction. A voice called back, though the words were indistinguishable at this range. It didn't matter. They had heard us, seen us. We were no longer alone. Behind us, at the edge of where the game trail met the main path, the forest went suddenly, completely silent. The pursuit, so frenzied moments before, ceased as if a switch had been flipped. I risked a glance back and saw nothing but darkening trees, the boundary between maintained trail and wilderness now seeming like a physical barrier our pursuers would not cross. Bella's posture relaxed slightly, though she continued to stare vigilantly at the forest edge as figures with flashlights made their way up the trail toward us. I sank to my knees, pulling Rebecca down beside me, both of us gasping for breath as the first wave of relief washed over us. "We made it," she whispered, tears streaming down her dirt-streaked face. "We actually made it out." But even as rescue approached in the form of concerned hikers and a uniformed park ranger, I couldn't shake the sensation that we weren't truly safe, that we had merely been granted a temporary reprieve. The forest loomed behind us, its secrets intact, its inhabitants merely retreating rather than defeated. Whatever dwelled in those depths had allowed us to escape. And somehow, that thought was more terrifying than the pursuit itself. The ranger's name was Watkins, a weathered man in his 50s with a perpetual furrow between his brows that deepened as we recounted our experience. He listened without interruption as we described becoming lost on the upper trail and the strange tunnel we'd discovered. I deliberately omitted details about what we'd seen inside, mentioning only that we'd been chased by something we couldn't clearly identify. "Probably a black bear," he suggested, making notes in a small waterproof book. "They're common in this area, though usually not aggressive unless you stumble near cubs." I exchanged glances with Rebecca, neither of us willing to challenge this comfortable explanation in front of the small crowd of hikers that had gathered around us. Bella, usually friendly with strangers, remained unusually subdued, pressing against my legs and flinching at every sound from the surrounding forest. "You folks are lucky," Watkins continued, closing his notebook. "We get at least 3 or 4 search and rescue operations every season for hikers who stray from marked trails. Not all of them end this well." His radio crackled with a request for his location, and he stepped away to respond, leaving us with the group of hikers who had been first to reach us. They offered water and energy bars, which we accepted gratefully. Their normalcy, their casual conversation and good-natured jokes about our bedraggled appearance, felt surreal after what we'd experienced. "The trails up there aren't well maintained anymore," an older man commented, gesturing toward the higher elevations. "Park Service closed most of them after the incidents in the 90s. My attention snapped to him. "What incidents?" He seemed surprised by my intensity. "You didn't know? A series of disappearances back in 97 and 98. Hikers vanishing from the upper trails, never found. They officially blamed it on a rogue cougar, but..." He shrugged. "A lot of locals never bought that explanation." "Why not?" Rebecca asked, her voice barely audible. "Cougars don't take personal belongings," the man replied simply. "And they certainly don't stack their victims' gear in neat piles, arranged in circles in the middle of clearings." My skin prickled as I recalled the strange markings we'd seen on trees around the clearing where we'd rested. Before I could ask further questions, Ranger Watkins returned, ending the conversation with his official presence. "I've called ahead to the station," he informed us. "There'll be a medical technician waiting to check you over. Standard procedure for lost hikers." "We weren't exactly lost," I began, but Rebecca squeezed my arm in warning. "Thank you," she said to Watkins. "We appreciate it." The descent to the trailhead seemed to take hours, though my watch indicated barely 40 minutes had passed. Darkness had fallen completely, and the forest pressed close on either side of the illuminated path. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every shift of branches overhead made me tense, expecting to see those dark shapes moving parallel to our course. Bella remained hyper-vigilant, occasionally stopping to stare intently into particularly dense sections of forest before reluctantly continuing forward. Her behavior did not go unnoticed by Ranger Watkins. "Your dog seems pretty spooked," he observed. "They usually sense things before we do." "She's been through a lot today," I deflected, urging Bella forward with gentle pressure on her leash. As promised, a medical technician waited at the ranger station. A young woman who efficiently checked our vital signs, and examined the various cuts and scrapes we'd accumulated during our flight through the forest. Satisfied that we required no immediate medical attention, she recommended rest and plenty of fluids. Throughout this process, I noticed Ranger Watkins engaged in low conversation with another uniformed officer who had arrived while we were being examined. They occasionally glanced in our direction, their expressions unreadable in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the station. Eventually, Watkins approached us with a clipboard containing standard forms documenting our experience. As I completed the paperwork, he cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I need to ask, this tunnel you mentioned, could you describe its location more specifically?" Something in his tone made me hesitate. It was off the upper trail, near a small clearing with unusually marked trees. "Why?" He exchanged glances with his colleague before responding. "We need to investigate any potentially unsafe features in the park. Natural tunnels or caves can collapse, posing dangers to hikers." "It wasn't natural," Rebecca stated flatly, her earlier caution apparently abandoned. "Someone, or something, made it." Watkins's expression remained carefully neutral. Old mining operations existed throughout these hills before the area became a state park. What you found was likely an abandoned prospect tunnel. "It had symbols carved into the walls," I added, studying his reaction. "And there were remains inside." The second ranger stepped forward. "Animal remains are common in sheltered areas. Predators often drag kills to protected locations to feed." Their coordinated response felt rehearsed, as if they'd had this conversation before with other hikers who'd stumbled upon similar discoveries. Before I could press further, Watkins closed the conversation decisively. "We appreciate your report and are glad you made it back safely. The upper trails will be temporarily closed for maintenance while we investigate." As we prepared to leave, the older hiker who had mentioned the disappearances approached us in the parking lot. He glanced toward the ranger station before speaking in a lowered voice. "They won't find anything, you know. They never do." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Whatever you saw up there, whatever chased you, it knows how to hide its traces. Been happening for generations." He handed me a worn business card with a local phone number. "If you want to know more, there's a group of us who've had similar experiences. We meet monthly." Before I could respond, he walked away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the lot's perimeter lighting. I pocketed the card without examining it further, suddenly eager to put as much distance as possible between ourselves and Cascade Falls. The drive home passed in near complete silence, both of us lost in our thoughts. Bella eventually succumbed to exhaustion in the back seat, though her sleep was fitful, punctuated by whimpers and twitching legs as she relived the day's trauma and canine dreams. As headlights illuminated the familiar streets of our neighborhood, Rebecca finally spoke. "We can't tell anyone else about this," she said quietly. "Not the details, anyway." I nodded, understanding her reasoning without explanation. The rational world had no framework for what we'd experienced. To share it would invite disbelief at best, concern for our mental health at worst. Yet as we pulled into our driveway, I couldn't escape the sensation that our return to normalcy was an illusion, that we had brought something back with us from those shadowed hills. Not a physical presence, but an awareness of something that existed beyond the boundaries of ordinary human experience. That awareness felt like a burden, knowledge that could never be unlearned or comfortably integrated into daily life. And worse, a growing certainty that what we had encountered was not finished with us, that our escape had been merely the opening chapter of a longer, darker narrative yet to unfold. 3 weeks passed with surprising normalcy. We returned to work, engaged in routine social activities, and gradually the physical evidence of our ordeal faded. The scratches healed, the bruises yellowed and disappeared. Only Bella's behavior remained persistently altered. She refused to enter certain rooms alone, particularly our basement office where the lighting was similar to the forest's dimness. She barked at shadows that slid across our bedroom wall at night and wedged herself between us in bed, something she had never done before. I found myself unable to discard the business card the older hiker had given me. It sat on my nightstand, a tangible reminder that we were not alone in our experience. The number remained uncalled, yet I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, as if doing so would somehow invalidate what had happened to us. Rebecca rarely spoke about that day, though I occasionally caught her staring into the distance, her expression haunted by memories she couldn't share with friends or colleagues. Our relationship became simultaneously closer and more isolated, bound by shared trauma, yet separated from others by the impossibility of articulating our experience. Sleep became problematic for both of us. I found myself waking at odd hours, convinced I'd heard the distinctive clicking sound from the forest. Rebecca experienced recurring nightmares that left her gasping and disoriented, though she refused to describe their content beyond saying, "It's still chasing us." On the surface, we functioned. Beneath, we were unraveling. The breaking point came unexpectedly. While sorting through hiking gear we hadn't touched since that day, I discovered something lodged in the treads of my boots. A small, oddly shaped object that initially resembled a stone or twig. Closer examination revealed it to be neither. The object, approximately the size of a guitar pick, appeared to be carved from bone. One surface bore markings similar to those we'd seen in the underground chamber. I showed it to Rebecca that evening, placing it carefully on our kitchen table. She stared at it with growing horror, then abruptly pushed back her chair. "Burn it," she said, her voice shaking. "Or bury it. I don't care which, but get it out of our house." "It might be evidence of..." "Evidence of what?" she interrupted. "What exactly do you think this proves? That we weren't imagining things? We know what happened to us, but no one else will ever believe it." "The group that man mentioned might," I suggested. "Other people have seen what we saw, experienced what we experienced." Rebecca's expression hardened. "And what good has it done them? Are they any less traumatized? Has anyone taken their accounts seriously?" I had no answer for that. She continued more softly. "I need to move forward. We need to move forward, not dwell on this or seek validation from strangers." That night, I stood in our backyard with the bone fragment and a metal trash can. I struck a match, watching the small flame flicker in the evening breeze before dropping it onto the kindling I'd arranged. As the fire caught and grew, I held the fragment over the flames, expecting to feel some sense of closure or relief when it was gone. Instead, I hesitated. Something about destroying this tangible connection to our experience felt wrong, not morally, but pragmatically. As if in erasing the evidence we would somehow become more vulnerable rather than less. In that moment of indecision, Bella began barking frantically from inside the house. Not her usual alert bark at passing delivery trucks or neighborhood cats, but the same terrified sound she'd made in the forest. Through the kitchen window, I could see her pressed against the glass, her entire body rigid with alarm as she stared not at me, but at something beyond me in the darkness at the edge of our property. I turned slowly, the bone fragment still clutched in my hand. The yard appeared empty. The boundary where maintained lawn met the beginning of woods revealed nothing unusual in the dim illumination from our porch light. Yet as I stared, I became aware of a subtle wrongness, a section of shadow that seemed deeper than it should be, more defined in its edges against the surrounding darkness. As I watched, the shadow shifted slightly, not moving location, but somehow adjusting its dimensions, becoming more solid and less easily dismissed as imagination. The familiar clicking sound emerged from that concentrated darkness, faint but unmistakable. I backed toward the house, the fire forgotten, the bone fragment now slick with sweat in my clenched fist. When my shoulder blades touched the back door, I fumbled blindly for the handle, unwilling to take my eyes from the darkness that now seemed to be gradually expanding toward me. Inside, Rebecca stood frozen in the kitchen, her face pale as she watched Bella's frantic reaction to whatever lurked outside. When I burst through the door, slamming and locking it behind me, she didn't ask questions. She simply moved to close all the curtains and blinds, while I checked that every entrance to our home was secured. We spent that night huddled in our bedroom with Bella between us, listening to subtle sounds of movement around the perimeter of our house. Soft scraping against siding, gentle pressure testing windows and doors. By morning, the sounds had ceased, and daylight revealed no evidence of any visitor. No footprints in the soft earth of our garden beds, no scratches on doors or window frames. Only the trash can in the backyard showed any sign of disturbance, tipped over, its contents scattered, the fire long extinguished. The bone fragment was gone. That afternoon, I finally called the number on the business card. A woman's voice answered on the third ring, neither greeting me nor identifying herself. I hesitated, suddenly uncertain what to say. "I found your group's contact information at Cascade Falls," I began awkwardly. "My wife and I had an experience there a few weeks ago." "What trail?" the woman asked without preamble. "The upper trail, beyond the main falls. We found a tunnel." A long silence followed before she responded. "First meeting is just you. No spouse, no friends, no recording devices. We'll text you the location after we verify you're alone." "Verify how?" I asked, but the line had already gone dead. I told Rebecca about the call that evening. She listened without interruption, then asked simply, "Are you going?" "I think I have to," I replied. "Whatever this is, it didn't end when we left the forest. It followed us home. We need to understand what we're dealing with." She nodded slowly. "Just be careful. Remember that trauma can make people believe all kinds of explanations that might not be true." The meeting was scheduled for the following evening at a location I would receive only an hour before the appointed time. As instructed, I went alone, driving to an unremarkable coffee shop in a neighboring town where only 3 other people waited. The older hiker from the park, a middle-aged woman with a prominent scar across her left cheek, and a younger man whose hands trembled slightly as he clutched his coffee cup. Our conversation lasted nearly 3 hours. They shared their own encounters, each story containing elements that resonated with our experience. The unnatural silence, the strange markings, the sensation of being herded rather than directly pursued. The woman, Carol, had actually seen one of the creatures clearly during daylight hours while conducting botanical research in the area 5 years earlier. Her description matched the glimpse I'd caught in the tunnel. Unnaturally tall, covered in what she described as fibrous material that wasn't quite fur or clothing, and possessing abnormally long limbs with too many joints. "They've been there as long as there have been historical records of the area," the older man, who introduced himself as Howard, explained. "Native tribes avoided those hills entirely. Early settlers reported encounters but were largely disbelieved." "What are they?" I asked, though I wasn't certain I wanted an answer. "We don't know exactly," Carol replied. "But they're intelligent, territorial, and apparently capable of limited communication with each other. They could easily eliminate anyone who ventures into their territory, but they don't always choose to. It's more like they're studying us." "Testing boundaries," the younger man, Peter, added. "Learning our capabilities and limitations." "Why hasn't anyone documented this?" I pressed. "In an age of smartphones and constant documentation, how is this not widely known?" Howard smiled grimly. "Think about it. Would you have believed any of this 3 months ago? Would you have accepted an account like yours from a stranger? Or would you have dismissed it as delusion, hallucination, or hoax?" He had a point. Even now, part of me searched for rational explanations despite having experienced the encounter firsthand. The human mind resists information that fundamentally challenges its understanding of reality. "There's something else you should know," Carol said, her voice dropping lower. "Once you've encountered them, once they've become aware of you individually, They don't lose interest. They'll find you eventually, wherever you go. What do you mean? I asked, though the bone fragment's disappearance had already suggested the answer. They mark their subjects, Peter explained. Sometimes physically, sometimes through means we don't understand. But they can track those they've interacted with across surprising distances. How do you know this? Carol pulled back her sleeve, revealing a series of parallel scars identical to the markings we'd seen on trees in the forest. Because we've all tried to run, she said simply. And they've all found us, no matter where we've hidden. I left the meeting with more questions than answers, and a growing sense that our encounter at Cascade Falls had not been random chance but the beginning of something we didn't yet understand. The group had offered no solutions, only commiseration and the cold comfort that we were not alone in our experience. Driving home through darkened streets, I found myself checking the rearview mirror with increasing frequency, unable to shake the sensation of being followed. The rational part of my mind attributed this to heightened anxiety after the meeting's disturbing revelations. The newly awakened part that had experienced the impossible refused to dismiss the feeling so easily. As I pulled into our driveway, the headlights swept across our front yard, briefly illuminating the edge where manicured lawn met the beginning of woodland. In that momentary flash of light, I caught a glimpse of something that shouldn't have been there. A tall, angular figure standing motionless among the trees. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving me questioning whether I'd actually seen anything at all. Inside, Rebecca waited with Bella at her side. One look at my expression told her everything she needed to know about the meeting. "They're still watching us, aren't they?" she asked quietly. I nodded, unable to soften this reality with comforting lies. The group believes they mark certain people for ongoing observation. That once they've identified someone of interest, they don't simply let them go. What do we do? It was the question I'd been dreading, because I had no satisfactory answer. The group's members had been living with this reality for years, adapting to occasional encounters and unexplained phenomena without finding any permanent resolution. We stay vigilant, I said finally. We document everything, compare notes with others who've had similar experiences. And we don't hike in unfamiliar forests anymore. Rebecca attempted a smile that didn't reach her eyes. So we just live with this? Except that there are things in the world beyond normal understanding, and some of them have taken an interest in us? For now, I agreed, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. That night, as we prepared for bed, Bella's head suddenly lifted from her paws, ears pricked forward in alert attention. She rose slowly, moving to the bedroom window that overlooked our backyard. A low growl built in her throat as she stared into the darkness beyond the glass. Rebecca and I exchanged glances, neither of us willing to look and confirm what we already knew. That something waited in the shadows, watching and assessing. Something patient and methodical that operated according to its own incomprehensible agenda. Something that had followed us from the wilderness into the supposed safety of civilization, blurring the boundaries we had always trusted to separate humanity from the unknown. We turned off the lights and lay in darkness, listening to Bella's continued growls and the almost imperceptible sounds of movement outside our home. Neither of us spoke the truth we both understood. This was not the end of our story, but merely a pause between chapters in an ongoing narrative we had never asked to join but could not escape. In the morning, we would again pretend normalcy. We would go to work, interact with colleagues, maintain the comforting fiction that the world operates according to known rules and predictable patterns. But in quiet moments, when shadows deepened and the veil between ordinary reality and something else grew thin, we would remember what lurked beyond that boundary, and know with terrible certainty that it remembered us as well.